My family thought it would be hilarious to leave me stranded in a dense Oregon forest on a summer trip. Let us see if she can survive the night, they laughed as their SUV sped away into the dust. I never came back. 20 years later, they came begging for a ghost to save them from federal prison. They had no idea the ruthless fixer standing before them was the very daughter they threw to the wolves. I am Sydney, 33 years old, and the chief executive officer of the most cutthroat crisis management firm in Chicago. Before I tell you how I dismantled my family's entire fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own kingdom after your family tried to destroy you. The scalding hot latte flew through the air, splattering violently against the pristine white marble wall of my Chicago office lobby. Do you have any idea who we are? A shrill voice echoed across the quiet reception area. We have been waiting for 5 entire minutes. Tell your boss to get down here right now before I have you fired. I stepped out of the private elevator, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit. My heels clicked against the floor in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The receptionist, shaking and covered in brown liquid, looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I gestured for her to step away, then turned my absolute attention to the chaos unfolding in my lobby. There stood my sister Courtney, wearing a designer trench coat she clearly could not afford anymore, her face flushed with entitled rage. Beside her stood my father William, sweating profusely in a wrinkled suit, and my mother Catherine clutching a knockoff designer bag as if it were a shield against poverty. A step behind them stood DeAndre, Courtney's husband, rubbing his temples in quiet exhaustion. William grabbed Courtney roughly by the arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of her coat. "Shut up," he hissed, his voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of fear and fury. "Do you want to ruin this like you ruined DeAndre's black card yesterday? We are literally begging for our lives here." DeAndre shifted his weight, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He had built a massive technology company from the ground up, fighting his way out of the south side of Chicago to become a self-made multimillionaire. DeAndre was a good man trapped in a family of leeches. He had paid off their country club memberships, funded Courtney's shopping addictions, and financed William's failing investments, all while being treated like a second-class citizen in his own home. For years, William and Catherine had looked down their noses at him, making thinly veiled racist comments about his background and how he was not a proper fit for their elite social circle. Now they were bleeding him dry, draining his hard-earned accounts to cover up their own massive financial crimes. I watched the pathetic display with cold detachment. They did not recognize me. To them, the 13-year-old girl they left to die in the woods was just a distant, inconvenient memory. To them, I was simply PK, the elusive, highly connected crisis manager they had spent their last dime to hire. I stepped fully into the light of the lobby. "That latte you just threw cost exactly $8, I said, my voice cutting through the large room like sharp glass. "But the temper tantrum you just threw cost you your last 5 minutes of freedom." Courtney whipped her head around, glaring at me with the same arrogant expression I remembered from childhood. "Who do you think you are?" she demanded. "I am the only reason the FBI has not kicked down the door of your suburban estate this very second," I replied evenly, watching the color drain from her face. "Your father's offshore accounts have been flagged by the IRS. Your mother's fraudulent charity tax returns are sitting on a federal agent's desk. You are currently facing 3 federal indictments for wire fraud and tax evasion." William pushed past Courtney, his hands trembling as he reached out toward me. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We were told you could fix this. We can pay whatever you want. DeAndre will cover your retainer today." I looked at DeAndre, noting the sheer exhaustion on his face, then looked back at William. "I do not take money from shell companies or overdrawn accounts," I stated clearly. "I will take your case, and I will make the federal charges disappear. But you will do exactly what I say starting right now." Catherine stepped forward, trying to muster her old aristocratic pride. "What are your terms?" she asked, trying to sound commanding. "My terms are simple," I said, signaling to my security detail, who stepped out from the shadows. "You will hand over your cell phones, your tablets, and every piece of electronics you have on you. You will cut all contact with the outside world. There is a private jet waiting at Midway Airport. You are all getting on it tonight, and you will spend the next 3 days at a remote safe house I operate in Oregon. We need to conduct a full forensic audit and build your cover stories before the feds strike. Courtney opened her mouth to protest, but William shoved his phone into the security guard's basket. "We will do it," he said desperately. "Whatever you say." As they frantically signed the ironclad non-disclosure agreements, I glanced down at their signatures. A rush of dark satisfaction washed over me. I turned to my head of security and lowered my voice so only he could hear. "Prep the Pine Ridge Reserve. I want them in cabin 4, exactly where the bear tore down the door 2 decades ago." My security chief nodded silently, his face an impenetrable mask, as he guided my terrified family toward the loading bay. The trap was set, and they were walking right into it, completely blind to the ghost leading them to the slaughter. The heavy glass doors of my conference room slid shut, sealing us inside a soundproof vault of mahogany and brushed steel. The temperature in the room was intentionally kept at a brisk 64 degrees. It is a psychological tactic I use to keep desperate clients uncomfortable and awake. William immediately began pacing the length of the room, tugging at his silk tie as if it were a noose. Courtney collapsed into one of the leather ergonomic chairs, aggressively tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the table. She glared at her phone, frantically swiping at a screen that showed 0 bars of service. "I employ signal jammers in this room for a reason." DeAndre took a seat at the far end of the table. He did not pace. He did not complain. He simply rested his elbows on the cold wood and buried his face in his hands. He looked like a man who had spent the last 5 years carrying a mountain of garbage on his back, only to realize the mountain was about to collapse and bury him alive. Catherine, however, remained entirely delusional about her current standing in the world. She stood near the head of the table, clutching her counterfeit designer handbag, and looked me up and down with an expression of profound distaste. She was attempting to project the aura of a wealthy matriarch, negotiating a minor inconvenience. She had no idea she was staring at her executioner. "Your retainer fee is absolutely astronomical," Catherine snapped, tossing the preliminary contract back onto the table. $2 million just to handle some overzealous auditors. It is highway robbery. We are not paying that. I know people in the state senate who can make this go away for a fraction of the cost. I remained standing, my hands resting lightly on the back of my chair. "Those state senators are currently sitting in a federal prosecutor's office, Catherine," I replied, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "They are actively negotiating plea deals and handing over every single text message your husband ever sent them regarding your offshore accounts. You do not have friends in high places anymore. You have liabilities." William stopped pacing and stared at me, the color draining completely from his face. His knees seemed to buckle slightly before he caught himself on the edge of the table. Courtney let out a sharp, frustrated groan, slamming her phone face down. "My platinum card was just declined at the valet," she whined, directing her anger entirely at her husband. "DeAndre, fix this right now. Call your wealth manager. Do you know how humiliating it was to have that valet look at me like I am poor? Fix the card, DeAndre." DeAndre slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot. "I cannot fix it, Courtney," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The feds froze all the accounts connected to your father's holding company. And because you insisted on tying our personal assets to his real estate portfolio to make your family look better on paper, my accounts are frozen too." Catherine slammed her hands down on the mahogany table, glaring at DeAndre with a mixture of panic and unadulterated venom. "Do not you dare raise your voice at my daughter," Catherine hissed. "You have a private tech company. You have clean funds hidden away in your corporate accounts. Wire the $2 million to this fixer right now." DeAndre stared at her in disbelief. "You want me to drain my company payroll to save William from a wire fraud conviction?" "You owe us," Catherine shouted, the polished veneer finally cracking to reveal the ugly, racist entitlement underneath. "We let you into our circle. We gave you credibility. You owe us for letting you marry into this family. You would be nothing but a South Side street kid if we had not given you our name." The silence in the room was absolute. DeAndre looked at his mother-in-law, a bitter realization washing over his face. He had built his entire tech empire from scratch. He was worth 10 times what they had ever been worth, yet they still looked at him like he was dirt on their shoes. I did not let DeAndre speak. I did not let him defend himself against a woman who was not fit to breathe the same air as him. I picked up a thick stack of non-disclosure agreements and slammed them onto the center of the table with enough force to make the heavy wood vibrate. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "Keep your son-in-law's clean money out of my office." I ordered, my eyes locking onto Catherine's. I do not take wire transfers from Cayman Island shell companies, and I certainly do not accept funds that the Department of Justice has already flagged for federal money laundering. PK does not work for charity, but I am taking this case because your particular brand of corruption fascinates me. William stumbled forward and grabbed a pen. "What do we have to do?" he begged, sweat rolling down his forehead. "Just tell us what to do to stay out of federal prison." "You sign these," I instructed, pushing the documents toward them. "You surrender your passports to my security team. You give up every single electronic device on your person, and you get on my private jet tonight. You will disappear to a secure remote location for 3 days while my team builds a firewall between you and the FBI. If you refuse, or if you hesitate for even 1 second, I will personally call the agents waiting outside your estate and tell them they have a green light to breach your front door." Panic erupted. William practically tore the paper trying to sign his name fast enough. Courtney was sobbing openly, her mascara running down her cheeks as she scribbled her signature, terrified of losing her country club lifestyle. Catherine stared at the paper, her chest heaving with indignant rage. She looked at me with pure, unfiltered hatred, furious that she was being forced to submit to someone else's authority. But the fear of a prison cell won. She snatched the pen and aggressively signed her name. I stepped forward and gathered the documents. I looked down at the freshly inked pages. William, Catherine, Courtney, the exact same signatures that had signed my emancipation papers. The exact same signatures that had legally discarded me like broken furniture 20 years ago. A cold thrill ran through my veins. They had just willingly signed their lives over to the very girl they left to die. I aligned the papers, tapping them neatly against the table. I turned my head slightly toward my head of security, who was standing like a statue by the heavy glass doors. I leaned in close, keeping my voice to a sharp, precise whisper. "Prep the Pine Ridge Reserve. Cabin 4. Exactly where the bear tore down the door 2 decades ago." The biting wind whipping across the tarmac at Chicago Midway Airport did nothing to chill the fiery entitlement radiating from my family as they approached the sleek black Gulfstream jet. They walked up the air stairs exactly as they had walked through life, expecting the world to bow to their presence. I followed closely behind my face, an unreadable mask, watching them settle into the plush leather seats of the cabin. Catherine immediately flagged down a flight attendant, demanding a glass of vintage champagne to calm her nerves, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality was currently crumbling to ash. Before the attendant could even pour the drink, Marcus, my head of security, stepped into the center of the cabin. He held a large, heavily lined Faraday bag open in his massive hands. Devices, he commanded, his voice leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. Phones, tablets, smartwatches, e-readers, everything goes in the bag. Courtney clutched her diamond-encrusted smartphone to her chest like a newborn child. "Excuse me," she snapped, her shrill voice echoing off the curved ceiling of the jet. "Absolutely not. I have the summer solstice gala at the country club this weekend. I am the chairwoman of the entire event. I have catering to coordinate and seating charts to finalize. I am not going off the grid for some ridiculous audit." Marcus did not blink. He stepped 1 inch closer to her. "The FBI uses cell tower triangulation and GPS pings to locate federal fugitives," he stated flatly. "If you keep that phone, they will have a strike team surrounding this plane before we even clear airspace. Drop it in the bag." Courtney looked at her father, her eyes welling with dramatic, manipulative tears. "Daddy, tell him. Tell him I cannot just disappear. The gala is the most important event of the season." William, ever the enabler of his golden child, stood up and patted Courtney on the shoulder. He puffed out his chest, trying to project the authority of a billionaire patriarch despite the fact that he was currently fleeing a federal indictment. "Now listen here, PK," he said. turning his desperate gaze toward me. My daughter has obligations. Surely we can set up a secure line for her. You work for us. I expect you to accommodate her needs. Just give her the phone. I will buy you a brand new Porsche Panamera the second this little misunderstanding with the feds is cleared up, Courtney. I promise. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The ice clinked softly against the crystal glass, the only sound in the sudden tense silence of the cabin. You cannot buy a Porsche with frozen assets, William, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly level. The air in the cabin evaporated. William froze, his hand still resting awkwardly on Courtney's shoulder. Catherine lowered her empty champagne flute, her jaw dropping slightly. DeAndre, who had been staring out the window into the dark night, slowly turned his head to look at me. What did you just say? Catherine whispered, the aristocratic superiority instantly vanishing from her tone. I set my glass down on the polished walnut table in front of me. Did you really think the FBI issues a courtesy warning before they lock down a criminal enterprise? I asked, leaning back in my chair. 20 minutes ago, while you were throwing a tantrum over spilled coffee in my lobby, a federal judge signed the seizure orders. Your domestic accounts are locked. Your offshore shell companies in the Caymans have been flagged and frozen by international authorities. Your credit cards are dead plastic. Your real estate portfolio is currently being seized as collateral. You are officially penniless. Courtney let out a choked gasp, dropping her phone into the black bag, as if the device had suddenly caught fire. William collapsed back into his seat, clutching his chest, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. We have nothing, he stammered, his eyes wide with blind terror. How are we supposed to survive? How are we paying you? You signed over the temporary holding rights to your remaining physical assets when you signed my non-disclosure agreements, I replied coldly. I own your problems now. Sit down, buckle your seatbelts, and remain silent for the rest of the flight. You no longer have the luxury of giving orders. For the next 4 hours, the cabin was a tomb. The only sound was the steady, deafening hum of the jet engines tearing through the night sky. I watched them squirm in their luxury seats. Catherine wrung her hands until her knuckles turned white. Courtney stared blankly at the floor, shivering, despite the warmth of the cabin. William kept muttering to himself, running frantic calculations in his head that would never add up. But DeAndre was different. He did not look panicked. He looked observant. I caught him staring at me from across the aisle, his sharp, analytical mind working overtime. He was a survivor, a man who built an empire from nothing, and his instincts were screaming that the woman sitting across from him was not a savior. The jet began its steep descent, plunging through the thick cloud cover. We traded the glowing, sprawling grid of city lights for absolute consuming blackness. We were descending into the Pacific Northwest, diving straight into the jagged, unforgiving wilderness of the Oregon mountains. The plane touched down violently on a private, unlit airstrip surrounded by towering Douglas firs. The trees loomed over the tarmac like massive, silent sentinels keeping watch. As the cabin door opened, the freezing, damp forest air flooded the jet. The heavy scent of wet earth, pine needles, and raw wilderness hit my lungs. It was a smell I had not breathed in 20 years. It was the smell of my own grave. I kept my face entirely impassive as I stood up and gestured for them to exit. A fleet of black armored SUVs waited on the tarmac, their headlights piercing the thick midnight fog. My security team herded the family into the back of the vehicles without a single word. I climbed into the lead SUV and the convoy immediately accelerated into the dense woods. The dirt road was treacherous, winding deeper and deeper into a forest that felt entirely cut off from the rest of humanity. No streetlights, no signs of civilization, just the oppressive weight of the ancient trees pressing in from all sides. After miles of navigating the brutal terrain, a massive stone archway emerged from the fog. Between the stone pillars stood a pair of imposing 20-foot steel gates. The security cameras mounted on the walls tracked our approach, and the heavy gates slowly ground open with a metallic shriek. The SUVs rolled through the entrance, crossing the threshold onto the Pine Ridge estate. The moment the rear bumper of the last vehicle cleared the gates, the thick steel slammed shut behind us. The heavy, visceral clank of the electronic locks engaging echoed loudly through the silent forest, sounding exactly like a prison cell slamming shut. In the rearview mirror of my SUV, I caught DeAndre's reflection. He was sitting in the back seat, his body completely rigid. He looked at the locked steel gates fading into the fog behind us, then slowly shifted his gaze forward until his eyes met mine in the mirror. The color drained from his face. He knew. He did not know the details and he did not know who I really was, but as he stared into my cold, dead eyes, DeAndre finally realized the terrifying truth. We were not hiding them from the monsters. We were trapping them inside the cage. The heavy silence in the cabin was broken only by the sharp intake of breath from Catherine. She stared at the plastic evidence bag, her eyes widening in genuine, unadulterated horror. The faded pink fabric of the backpack seemed to glow under the warm lights of the chandelier, a grotesque centerpiece on the polished mahogany. "What is the meaning of this?" William demanded, his voice shaking violently as he pushed his chair back. "Where did you get that? What does a piece of garbage have to do with our federal indictment?" I did not answer him. I kept my eyes locked on Courtney, who had suddenly gone entirely still. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She recognized it. The glittery butterfly patch, sewn onto the front pocket, was unmistakable, even under 2 decades of grime. "You claimed you hated the wilderness, Catherine," I said, leaning forward and resting my hands on the table. "But the FBI does not just look at bank statements. They look at history. They look at behavioral patterns. They look at leverage. And right now, a federal prosecutor is wondering how a family that preaches loyalty and pristine social standing has a police report from 20 years ago gathering dust in a local precinct." DeAndre looked from the backpack to his wife. "Courtney, what is she talking about?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "Whose bag is that?" Courtney squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head, bringing her hands up to cover her ears. "Stop it!" she whispered frantically. "I do not want to talk about this. Stop talking about it." I picked up the evidence bag and slowly turned it so the shredded shoulder strap was facing William. "Do you remember the statement you gave to the state troopers, William? You told them she wandered off. You told them you turned your back for 5 minutes at a rest stop and she was just gone. You cried for the local news cameras. You begged the public for information." Catherine slammed her fist against the table, her face contorted with panic. "You have no right to bring this up. We hired you for financial protection. Our daughter was taken from us. It was a tragedy. It has nothing to do with the IRS. It has everything to do with who you really are," I replied, my voice slicing through her pathetic defense. "The FBI builds character profiles. They look for weaknesses. And leaving a 13-year-old girl behind in a forest known for aggressive wildlife is not a tragedy, Catherine. It is a calculated disposal." William stood up, his face a terrifying shade of purple. "I will not sit here and be accused of nonsense by an employee. We loved her. We searched for weeks. We spent thousands on private investigators." "You spent exactly $0 on private investigators," William the First stated, pulling a thick, perfectly bound file from my briefcase. I dropped it next to the backpack. I pulled the financial records from the year she went missing. "While the police were dragging the river, you were finalizing the purchase of a new vacation home in Aspen. While the search dogs were combing the woods, Catherine was hosting a charity gala for endangered wildlife, writing off the catering expenses through your fraudulent shell company." DeAndre stood up slowly. His towering frame cast a long shadow across the table. He looked at William, then at Catherine, profound disgust radiating from every line of his body. "You bought a house?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Your daughter goes missing, and you bought a ski lodge." "It was a distraction," Courtney screamed, finally dropping her hands from her ears. "We were grieving. We needed somewhere to go to get away from the press." "You needed somewhere to celebrate," I corrected coldly. Because without the financial burden of a second child, William could finally afford the down payment. The room erupted into chaos. Catherine began hyperventilating, claiming she was having a heart attack. William yelled at DeAndre to sit down while Courtney sobbed hysterically into her arms. I watched them tear each other apart, feeling nothing but clinical satisfaction. They were so fragile, so easily broken by the truth they had buried under decades of expensive champagne and designer clothes. "Sit down," I commanded, raising my voice just enough to shatter the noise. DeAndre was the only one who did not flinch. He remained standing, staring at the faded pink backpack. He looked at the torn strap, then slowly shifted his gaze to me. The realization in his eyes was sharpening, evolving from suspicion into a terrifying clarity. "This is not a crisis audit," DeAndre said quietly, his voice cutting through the remaining whimpers from Catherine. "You are not building a firewall." I met his gaze, acknowledging the intelligence he possessed that the rest of his family completely lacked. "I am isolating the infection," I replied. I turned my attention back to William and Catherine. "Stand up," I ordered. William gripped the edge of the table. "What are you doing? We paid you to help us." "Stand up," I repeated, signaling to Marcus, who stepped forward and grabbed William by the collar of his suit, hauling him to his feet. Two other security guards moved in, pulling Catherine from her chair despite her screeching protests. "You are going to help us prep for the federal interrogation," I told them, picking up the file from the table. "We are going to separate you. We are going to break down exactly what you will say to the FBI regarding the missing funds, and we are going to find out exactly who you are willing to sell out to save yourselves." I walked toward the heavy oak door at the end of the living room, opening it to reveal a stark, brightly lit interrogation room. It contained nothing but a metal table and 3 chairs. "Bring them in," I instructed the guards. As they dragged my screaming parents down the hallway, Courtney tried to run after them. Marcus stepped in her path, his massive frame blocking her completely. "You stay here," Marcus told her, his voice like grinding stone. I looked back at DeAndre, who was still standing by the dining table. "I will deal with you shortly," I said. "Do not touch the bag." I stepped into the interrogation room and shut the heavy door behind me, sealing William and Catherine inside. The lock clicked into place. They were finally exactly where I wanted them, isolated, terrified, and completely at my mercy. The interrogation room was a sensory deprivation chamber designed to break the human spirit. The walls were painted a flat, clinical gray. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed with a low, relentless vibration that drilled directly into the skull. There were no windows, no clocks, and absolutely no distractions from the cold, solid steel table bolted to the concrete floor. I took my seat on one side of the table, sitting perfectly upright. William and Catherine sat across from me, looking like a pair of exotic birds trapped in a sterile cage. I opened my leather briefcase, the snap of the brass locks echoing sharply in the quiet room. I pulled out a thick stack of manila folders and a silver fountain pen, laying them out with methodical precision. I did not speak. I let the oppressive silence stretch, watching the psychological weight of their reality press down on their shoulders. William was the first to crack. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and frantically dabbed at the sweat pooling on his forehead. "PK, you have to understand," he stammered, his voice thin and desperate. "We are not criminals. We are victims of a misunderstanding. The tax codes are overly complicated. My wealth managers made aggressive choices. I cannot go to federal prison. I would not survive a week in there." Catherine nodded vigorously, her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric of her skirt. "The media fallout alone will destroy our legacy," she added, her eyes wide with panic. "Our friends will abandon us. The country club board will demand our resignation. You are a crisis manager. Your entire job is to find a way out of this. We need a scapegoat. We need someone else to take the fall." I slowly uncapped my fountain pen. "The paper trail leads directly to your personal signatures, William." I stated, my tone devoid of any empathy. "The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands are registered under your middle name. The fraudulent charity distributions bear Catherine's direct endorsement. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not care about your country club memberships. They care about wire fraud. If you want a scapegoat, you need someone who had the motive, the means, and the access to orchestrate a financial conspiracy of this magnitude." William and Catherine exchanged a long, loaded look. It was a look of shared predatory instinct. They were two wolves realizing they could survive if they simply threw someone else to the hounds. Catherine leaned forward, resting her elbows on the cold steel table. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, completely unaware that she was digging her own grave. "What about DeAndre?" she suggested. I kept my face perfectly neutral, though a cold fury began to simmer in my veins. "Go on," I instructed evenly. William eagerly jumped in, sensing a lifeline. "DeAndre is a tech genius," he explained rapidly. "His company handles massive amounts of data and capital. He set up our home networks. He had full access to our private servers. It would be incredibly easy for someone with his skill set to hack into my accounts, set up those shell companies, and move the money without my knowledge." "He is your son-in-law," I pointed out, playing the role of the detached, amoral fixer. "He has funded your lifestyle for years. Why would he frame you?" Catherine scoffed, a sound of pure aristocratic disgust. "Because he is resentful." She sneered, her true ugly nature spilling out into the sterile room. "He is a black man who grew up in the projects. The FBI will easily believe he masterminded a money laundering scheme over a respectable white family. It fits the narrative perfectly. An arrogant, self-made street kid trying to steal from his elite in-laws." The sheer audacity of her racism hung in the air, toxic and vile. They were perfectly willing to destroy an innocent, brilliant man who had loved their daughter simply because of the color of his skin and the zip code where he was born. They viewed DeAndre not as family, but as a resource to be drained and a shield to be sacrificed. "He owes us," Catherine continued, her voice rising with unearned righteousness. "We gave him credibility in Chicago high society. We let him marry into our bloodline. Taking the fall for this is the least he can do." Underneath the table, I pressed my thumb against the face of my watch. A tiny, almost invisible red light began to pulse. The high-definition audio recorder embedded in my briefcase was now capturing every single syllable. "You are asking me to help you fabricate evidence," I said, making sure my voice was loud and clear for the recording. "You want to backdate digital footprints to make it look like DeAndre transferred the stolen funds into his own corporate accounts. You want to commit perjury to federal agents and frame an innocent man to avoid your own prison sentences. Is that correct?" "Yes," William answered without a fraction of a second of hesitation. "We will testify to whatever you need us to say. We will swear under oath that DeAndre controlled the finances. Just make the paperwork match the story." I looked at them, really looked at them. For 20 years I had wondered if maybe I had exaggerated their cruelty in my childhood memories. I had wondered if maybe deep down they possessed some small shred of human decency. This room provided the final undeniable answer. They were monsters in tailored suits. I reached down and pressed my watch again, locking the recording into a secure cloud server. DeAndre was finally free. He just did not know it yet. I slowly closed the manila folder and set my pen down. The sharp click of the pen cap sounded like a gavel dropping. I folded my hands together and rested them on top of the file, locking my eyes onto Catherine's. "You are remarkably good at framing the innocent," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. William frowned, confused by the sudden shift in my tone. "What do you mean?" "We are just doing what we have to do to survive." I ignored him, keeping my dead, unblinking gaze fixed entirely on my mother. I leaned forward, pressing my hands flat against the cold metal table, closing the physical distance between us. "You are good at framing the innocent," I continued, enunciating every word with deliberate precision. "Just like how you framed your youngest daughter for stealing your Cartier watch so you wouldn't have to admit Courtney pawned it for gambling debts." The blood instantly vanished from Catherine's face, leaving her skin the color of dirty chalk. Her mouth dropped open and a strangled, wet gasp escaped her throat. She gripped the edge of the steel table so hard her knuckles turned white. William froze, his eyes darting wildly between his wife and the stranger sitting across from them. Catherine swallowed hard, her chest heaving, as she stared at me in absolute paralyzing terror. "How do you know that?" I did not answer her. I simply let the silence stretch, watching the sheer terror paralyze Catherine's perfectly lifted face. The absolute certainty that I held all their darkest secrets was a far more effective weapon than any verbal response. I picked up my briefcase, turned on my heel, and walked out. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, sealing William and Catherine inside a tomb of their own making. In the main living area, Courtney was pacing frantically, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Marcus stood exactly where I had left him, an immovable wall of muscle blocking her path. When she saw me, she immediately opened her mouth to scream another demand, but I did not give her the chance. Put her in holding room 3, I told Marcus, not even looking in Courtney's direction. Let her sit in the dark until she remembers how to speak to adults. Courtney shrieked as Marcus gripped her arm, hauling her effortlessly down the opposite hallway. I ignored her completely and turned my attention to DeAndre. He had not moved from his spot near the dining table. His eyes tracked my every movement, sharp and calculating. He was waiting for the axe to fall. "Follow me," I said, gesturing toward the second interrogation room at the far end of the corridor. DeAndre walked with a quiet, heavy dignity. He did not protest or ask pointless questions. He simply stepped into the stark gray room and sat down at the metal table, folding his hands together. He looked like a man preparing to hear his own death sentence. I sat across from him and opened my briefcase. I did not pull out financial ledgers or tax documents. Instead, I withdrew a sleek black tablet and placed it flat on the steel surface between us. "I am not going to interrogate you, DeAndre," I said, keeping my voice even. "I am going to show you exactly what your loyalty has bought you." I tapped the screen. The high-definition audio recording I had just captured in the adjacent room began to play. The sound quality was flawless. William and Catherine's desperate, panicked voices filled the small space. DeAndre sat perfectly still as he listened to his father-in-law eagerly pitch a plan to hack the family servers and backdate digital footprints to frame him. Then came Catherine's voice. The raw, unfiltered venom dripped from the tablet speaker. "He is a black man who grew up in the projects. The FBI will easily believe he masterminded a money laundering scheme over a respectable white family." I watched DeAndre's face as his mother-in-law's racist contempt echoed off the concrete walls. He did not gasp. He did not shout. But his stoic facade fractured. A profound, exhausting grief washed over his features. His broad shoulders slumped as if the invisible weight he had been carrying for years had finally snapped his spine. The recording played William's final damning promise to swear under oath and send DeAndre to federal prison. I reached out and tapped the screen, cutting the audio. The silence that followed was suffocating. They did not even hesitate. DeAndre whispered, staring blankly at the dark tablet screen. "Not for a single second. I built their network. I secured their wealth. I funded their lifestyle when their investments tanked. And they sold me to the feds without a second thought." "Why did you stay?" I asked quietly. "A man with your intellect and resources does not endure that level of blatant disrespect unless he is trapped." DeAndre let out a harsh, bitter laugh and ran a hand over his face. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against his palms. "Because Courtney made sure I had no way out," he said, his voice thick with repressed anger. "When I built my tech company, it was just a startup. I was pouring every cent I had into it. Her family's lawyers drafted our prenuptial agreement. They buried a dozen clauses in the fine print tying my intellectual property to their holding company." He lifted his head, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and profound regret. "The day I finally told her I was leaving, she laughed in my face. She told me she would take half of my company, drag my name through the mud, and use her father's connections to ensure no venture capitalist ever looked my way again. She promised to destroy the only clean thing I had ever built. So I stayed. I swallowed their racist remarks. I paid for their galas. I played the grateful charity case from the South Side because I thought I was protecting my life's work. I thought I could outsmart them. "You cannot outsmart people who have no moral baseline," I replied. "They do not play by the rules of logic. They play by the rules of survival, but their survival requires a sacrifice, and you are no longer on the altar." I reached into my briefcase again. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope and slid it across the metal table. It stopped inches from his hands. DeAndre stared at it warily. What is this? I leveraged their panic 20 minutes ago, I explained smoothly. Before I confiscated their devices, I had William and Catherine sign over full power of attorney to my firm, granting me absolute control to dissolve their immediate liabilities to protect the estate. Courtney signed the same agreement, assuming it was a shield to protect her country club status. She did not read the addendums. DeAndre's eyes widened as he slowly opened the envelope. He pulled out a stack of documents, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Those are pre-signed ironclad divorce papers, I said, leaning back in my chair. Drafted by the best corporate litigators in the country. Because Courtney willingly signed her assets into a blind crisis trust managed by me, I had the legal authority to sever your companies from their holding group. Your intellectual property is completely untangled. Your corporate accounts are insulated. She gets absolutely nothing. You are completely clean, DeAndre. And you are officially a free man. DeAndre stopped breathing. He stared at the blue ink signatures at the bottom of the pages, his hands shaking slightly. He looked up at me, completely stunned, struggling to comprehend that the chains holding him hostage had just been shattered in an instant. Before he could speak, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a heavy set of metal keys on a thick black lanyard. I dropped them directly on top of the divorce papers. The metal clattered sharply against the table. There is a private helipad on the flat roof of the main compound, I told him, holding his gaze with absolute intensity. A fueled chopper is waiting. Leave before sunset. They are about to lose everything. The heavy steel door of the second interrogation room crashed open, slamming against the concrete wall with deafening force. Courtney stood in the threshold, her chest heaving and her designer dress crumpled. She had somehow managed to slip past Marcus in the main corridor, driven entirely by the manic, consuming terror of a woman realizing her safety net was unraveling. She stormed into the center of the sparse room, her wild eyes darting from the empty metal chair across from me to the scattered copies of legal documents left on the table. The rhythmic, heavy thud of helicopter blades chopped through the crisp mountain air outside. Courtney lunged toward the reinforced glass window, pressing her hands against the cold pane. She stared up into the graying sky just in time to see the sleek black helicopter bank sharply over the dense pine canopy. Its navigation lights blinked a steady rhythm as it accelerated, fading rapidly into the creeping twilight. "Where is my husband?" Courtney demanded, spinning around to face me. Her voice was shrill, bordering on completely hysterical. "Did you send him to the city to get our money? Tell me you sent him to fix this." I remained seated, methodically gathering the remaining copies of the divorce documents and tapping them into a neat stack against the table. "I did not send him anywhere, Courtney," I replied, my tone utterly conversational. "I simply unlocked the door and showed him the exit. DeAndre is gone." Courtney marched forward, slamming her hands down on the metal table. "What do you mean he is gone? He cannot leave. He is legally bound to my family holding company. His tech patents, his corporate accounts, his personal wealth, it all belongs to the estate. He cannot just fly away." "He is no longer bound to anything with your family name on it," I stated, sliding the duplicate set of documents across the table until they rested directly under her manicured hands. "While you were throwing a tantrum in the main cabin of my jet, you signed a blind crisis trust agreement. You handed me full, unquestionable legal authority to dissolve your immediate liabilities to protect the core estate. You authorized me to cut the dead weight." Courtney stared at the papers, her breathing turning shallow and rapid. "What did you do?" "I identified the one clean asset your family was dragging down with your federal wire fraud," I explained smoothly. "DeAndre's tech empire was insulated, but your father was using it as a shield. So I used my new power of attorney to sever his companies from your holding group. I executed a total financial extraction. DeAndre just drained every single joint account you shared, withdrawing his rightful, legally protected capital. He signed these ironclad divorce papers exactly 4 minutes ago. You get absolutely nothing." The words struck her like physical blows. Courtney physically stumbled backward, her legs hitting the edge of the second metal chair. She looked down at the divorce papers, the bold blue ink of DeAndre's signature staring back at her. her entire identity, her wealth, her social standing, the country club galas, the designer wardrobe. All of it was built on the foundation of her husband's money and her father's fraudulent empire. Now, both pillars had been smashed to dust in a single afternoon. "You ruined my life!" Courtney shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat with pure, unadulterated venom. "You arrogant, vindictive witch! You work for us! You are supposed to protect me!" She lunged across the table. Her hand moved in a blur of motion fueled by blind, aristocratic rage. The open-handed slap struck the left side of my face with a sharp, echoing crack that rang through the sterile interrogation room. The sheer force of the impact snapped my head to the side. A sharp, hot sting radiated across my cheekbone, the distinct imprint of her heavy diamond engagement ring biting into my skin. Marcus stepped into the doorway instantly, his hand dropping to the tactical belt at his waist. He was ready to throw her to the concrete floor and restrain her. I held up one hand, palm facing out, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Do not touch her," I commanded, my voice eerily calm. I slowly turned my head back to face Courtney. She was standing there, chest heaving, her hand still raised in the air, trembling from the adrenaline. She expected me to scream. She expected security to drag her away. She expected the same chaotic, dramatic reaction she had spent her entire life weaponizing against other people. Instead, I simply reached up and lightly brushed my fingertips against the burning red mark on my cheek. I looked at her, and a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. The last time someone in this family slapped me, I whispered, my voice dropping to a chilling, deadened register. "We were standing in this exact forest right before you drove away." The air in the room turned to solid ice. Courtney froze. The furious, entitled rage completely vanished from her features, replaced instantly by a look of sheer, suffocating terror. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. Her eyes widened, staring at my face, tracing the lines of my jaw, the shape of my eyes searching for a ghost she thought had died 2 decades ago. Her hand slowly dropped to her side as the catastrophic reality of who had just trapped them in this cabin finally tore through her mind. "You are dead," Courtney whispered, the blood completely vanishing from her lips. "We left you there." I did not validate her panic with an answer. I simply held her terrified gaze, letting the silence crush her. The heavy steel door swung open again. Marcus marched in, practically dragging William and Catherine by their collars. He shoved them into the room, effectively trapping the entire family in the cold, gray space. William stumbled, catching himself against the metal table. He looked frantically at the open window, the chilling night air blowing in, and then at Courtney's ghost-white face. "What was that noise?" William demanded, his chest heaving as he pointed a trembling finger toward the window. "Who just flew out of here?" "Your only lifeline," I answered, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "DeAndre is gone." Catherine let out a sharp gasp, grabbing the edge of the table to steady herself. "Gone? What do you mean, gone? He cannot leave. He has to take the fall for the offshore accounts. He took his money, his patents, and his freedom," I stated coldly. "He drained the joint accounts. He severed his companies from your holding group. Right now, your corporate infrastructure is nothing but a hollow shell waiting to collapse." William yanked his phone from his pocket, his fingers frantically tapping the screen. His eyes darted wildly as he opened his banking applications. The color drained from his face just as quickly as it had from his daughter's. "Zero," William choked out, staring at the screen in absolute horror. "The domestic accounts are empty. The Cayman routing numbers are showing a total deficit." "He was the only liquid asset you had left," I explained, leaning against the edge of the steel table, watching their empire burn to the ground. "Your entire fortune was built on a foundation of his hard work and your fraudulent wire transfers. Now that he has untangled his assets, you have absolutely zero financial backing." Panic erupted in the room. Catherine began pacing frantically, her hands tugging at her expensive pearls. Courtney remained frozen against the wall, her mind trapped between the reality of her husband leaving and the terrifying ghost standing in front of her. "This is your fault," William barked, turning his rage entirely on me. You are supposed to be a crisis manager. You were supposed to fix this. You let him walk right out the door. I am managing the crisis, I replied smoothly, ignoring his outburst. DeAndre's sudden financial extraction just triggered an automatic red flag across the SEC banking algorithms. The paper trail is no longer buried under his tech security. It is completely exposed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is moving in right now. The word FBI hit them like a physical strike. Catherine stopped pacing, her breath catching in her throat. They have signed warrants. I continued pressing my advantage. They are not just coming for your bank accounts. They are coming for the physical assets. The estate in the Hamptons, the penthouse in Manhattan, the cars, the art collections, the jewelry. Everything with your name attached to it will be seized by the federal government before midnight. No, Courtney suddenly shrieked, snapping out of her terrified trance. They cannot take my house. I just spent $4 million importing Italian marble for the foyer. They are not taking my home. She stormed forward, ignoring the fact that she was speaking to the sister she had discarded decades ago. Her materialistic obsession temporarily overrode her fear of the past. You have to stop them, Courtney demanded, slamming her fist against the table. Call whoever you need to call. Bribe them. Do your job. There is no bribing the federal government when the warrants are already signed, I stated flatly. There is only one legal loophole left to save your physical estate. You have to transfer everything to a blind corporate entity. You have to hide it. William looked up, his eyes wide with desperate predatory hope. Hide it. How? I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of heavy watermarked documents. I laid them out on the table with deliberate precision. The Obsidian Group. I announced, tapping the top page. It is a private international crisis trust. If you sign these transfer deeds right now, you temporarily sign over all real estate, all physical assets, and all remaining domestic holdings to my firm. The federal government cannot seize assets that belong to a foreign insulated corporation. We shield your properties until the investigation blows over. Once the dust settles, the trust dissolves, and the assets revert back to your control. It was the ultimate illusion. A life raft made of lead, and they were just desperate enough to jump on it. William stepped forward, reaching for the silver fountain pen on the table. Where do I sign? Are you insane? Courtney screamed, grabbing her father's arm and yanking him back. You are not signing over my mansion to her. Look at her, Dad. Look at her face. Courtney pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. She is not a crisis manager. I know who she is. We cannot give her everything. William did not look at me. He did not care about the past. He only cared about the flashing red lights of the FBI closing in on his future. He violently shoved Courtney's hand away. I am not giving up my house, Courtney shrieked, stepping between her father and the table. It is mine. DeAndre bought it for me. I am not signing the deed over to some shady trust. William's face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The polished aristocratic patriarch completely vanished, revealing the vicious, self-serving monster underneath. He lunged forward and grabbed Courtney roughly by the shoulders, his fingers digging deeply into her designer dress. You are a useless dependent, Courtney, William roared, shaking her so hard her teeth rattled. Without DeAndre, you have nothing. You do not own anything. You have never earned a single dime in your entire pathetic life. Your name is on those deeds because I put it there. Courtney whimpered, tears streaming down her face as her father completely dismantled her. The FBI is coming for all of us. William continued, his voice echoing violently off the concrete walls. If those assets are seized, we have no leverage. We have no money for lawyers. We have no way to fight the charges. Sign the paper, or we all go to prison. He shoved her backward. Courtney stumbled, crashing into the wall and sliding down until she hit the floor. She wrapped her arms around her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The golden child had finally been broken by the very man who created her. Catherine stood frozen in the corner, offering zero comfort to her daughter. She simply stared at the pen, her own self-preservation calculating the odds. I watched the entire family tear each other apart in a matter of seconds. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of greed and panic. I stepped forward, resting my hands flat against the table, framing the transfer deeds. Sign, or the feds will be here in an hour. The heavy silver fountain pen lay on the cold steel table, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room. It was the only object in the room that belonged to their world of extreme wealth, and it was about to be the instrument of their total ruin. William stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. The threat of the FBI arriving in an hour hung over them like a guillotine. William knew the feds. He knew they did not negotiate. If they seized the assets, he would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell. He reached for the pen. His hand, which had confidently signed away thousands of jobs and shuttered corporations without a second thought over his 40-year career, was violently shaking. He pulled the first thick stack of watermarked documents toward him. The Obsidian Group transfer deeds. He did not bother to read the fine print. Desperation had entirely overridden his sharp legal instincts. He pressed the nib to the paper. The scratch of the metal against the heavy stock echoed loudly in the silent room. He signed away the Manhattan penthouse. He signed away the Hamptons estate. He signed over the controlling shares of the holding company. With every stroke of the pen, he was voluntarily disemboweling his own empire, genuinely believing he was building a fortress. William shoved the stack toward Catherine. "Do it!" He barked, his voice hoarse and stripped of all its usual refined authority. Catherine approached the table on unsteady legs. She picked up the pen, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, bony white. She looked down at the documents, transferring her prized art collections, the offshore trusts in the Caymans, and the legacy funds she had spent decades curating and protecting. She hesitated, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes, searching for a shred of reassurance in my flat expression. I gave her nothing. She swallowed hard, lowered her head, and signed. Then it was Courtney's turn. She was still crumpled against the base of the concrete wall, clutching her bruised knees. William marched over, grabbed her by the elbow, and hauled her to her feet with zero parental affection. He practically dragged her to the table, slamming her down into the metal chair. "Sign the damn papers, Courtney." William snarled, his face inches from hers. Courtney's eyes darted from the documents to my face. Unlike her parents, who were entirely consumed by the immediate threat of federal prison, Courtney's terror was rooted in something much deeper. She remembered the slap. She remembered the forest. She knew exactly who I was. Her jaw trembled uncontrollably. She picked up the pen, tears dripping off her chin and splattering onto the pristine legal documents. She looked at the deed for the $4 million mansion she had lorded over her social circle. She sobbed a pathetic wet sound and dragged the pen across the signature line. She signed away the luxury vehicles, the private accounts DeAndre had left her, and the equity in the country club. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was a ghost legally stripped of everything that gave her an identity. As Courtney dropped the pen and buried her face in her hands, Catherine attempted to salvage some shred of dignity. She smoothed the front of her wrinkled skirt and took a deep, shaky breath, trying to summon the aristocratic poise she had worn like armor her entire life. She looked across the table at me, her eyes desperate for an alliance. She still believed I was PK, the ruthless high-end crisis manager they had hired. She thought we were cut from the same cloth. "You understand how hard it is to protect family, right?" Catherine said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, almost intimate whisper. "Sometimes you have to make terrible sacrifices to keep the wolves away. You understand that?" I slowly stacked the signed documents, perfectly aligning the edges against the metal table. I did not look up immediately. I let her question hang in the air, letting her steep in her own pathetic attempt at bonding. I tapped the stack of papers one final time, then raised my eyes to meet hers. My gaze was completely devoid of human warmth. "I wouldn't know," I replied, my voice echoing with a chilling, hollow calm. "My family left me to be eaten by wolves." Catherine blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. She opened her mouth to ask what I meant, but the heavy steel door of the room swung open before she could form the words. Marcus stepped inside. He did not look at William, Catherine, or the weeping Courtney. He walked directly to the table, opened a reinforced black briefcase, and silently packed the signed documents inside. He snapped the brass locks shut, the sharp click sounding like a vault ceiling. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my blazer. I did not say another word. I did not offer them a reassuring nod, nor did I explain the next steps of their supposed salvation. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the room, Marcus falling into step perfectly behind me. "Wait!" William shouted from the room, his heavy footsteps rushing toward the door. "Where are you going? What about the feds? What do we do now?" I kept walking down the corridor, the sound of my heels against the floor, completely ignoring his frantic questions. As Marcus and I crossed the threshold into the main living area, I pulled a small remote from my pocket. The cabin was a fully integrated smart home controlled entirely by a central server. I pressed a single button. Instantly, the massive floor-to-ceiling luxury gas fireplace in the center of the room shut off with a sharp hiss, extinguishing the only source of warmth. The ambient lighting dropped to a harsh, dim emergency setting. The automated steel security shutters on the windows violently slammed down, locking into place with a heavy metallic thud. The heavy metallic thud of the security shutters locking into place echoed through the massive cabin. The sound was brutal, final, and deafening. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and freezing. The illusion of the high-end crisis retreat shattered the exact moment the fireplace hissed and died. Then the lighting shifted. The warm, golden ambient glow that had bathed the room in a comforting, expensive hue flickered and snapped off. In its place, rows of harsh, clinical fluorescent bulbs ignited across the ceiling. The light was blinding, casting stark, ugly shadows across the room and highlighting the sudden panic etched into my family's faces. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary for the elite. It felt like a concrete holding cell. Before William could even demand an explanation for the sudden blackout, the heavy oak doors leading to the kitchen and service corridors swung violently open. The catering staff and private concierges, who had been hovering discreetly all evening with silver trays and polite bows, marched into the room. But their deferential smiles and pristine white gloves were gone. Their posture had changed entirely. They moved with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a tactical cleanup crew executing a raid. Two men in dark utility uniforms walked directly up to William. They did not excuse themselves. They did not ask him to step aside. One of them simply bent down, grabbed the thick embroidered edge of the antique Persian rug William was standing on, and yanked it upward. William stumbled, his arms flailing as he barely caught his balance. The men rolled the heavy silk rug right out from under his Italian leather shoes without a second glance. "What in God's name are you doing?" William barked, his voice cracking as he scrambled backward. "Put that down. Do you know how much that costs?" The men ignored him completely. They hoisted the heavy rug onto their shoulders and carried it out the front door, leaving William standing on the bare, freezing hardwood floor. Across the expansive living room, the culinary team descended on the mahogany dining table. The spread of catered luxury, the imported beluga caviar, the artisan cheeses, the crystal decanters of reserve wine was swiftly swept away. But they did not carefully pack the food into storage containers. A woman in a black tactical shirt snapped open a heavy-duty industrial trash bag and began sweeping her arm across the table, dumping the silver platters directly into the plastic. The sickening crash of crystal glasses and fine china shattering inside the trash bag filled the room with a sharp, violent noise. "Stop it!" Catherine shrieked, clutching her hands to her chest as she watched a vintage bottle of Bordeaux casually tossed into the garbage. "Have you all lost your minds? We are the guests here. We are paying for this food." Nobody answered her. The crew continued stripping the room completely bare. They removed the plush velvet throw pillows from the leather sofas. They unhooked the original oil paintings from the walls, revealing bare, unpainted drywall beneath. They were erasing every single trace of comfort, every illusion of wealth, leaving behind only the cold, skeletal structure of the cabin. The temperature in the room was plummeting by the second. Without the massive gas fireplace and with the automated climate control completely shut down, the bitter mountain air seeped through the floorboards and the cracks in the walls. Courtney remained huddled on the floor, shivering uncontrollably. A worker walked right past her, his heavy boots thudding against the wood, and unplugged the designer floor lamp standing inches from her head. She wrapped her arms tighter around her knees, her eyes wide and unblinking, watching the total deconstruction of her reality. She was entirely catatonic, her mind completely shattered by the loss of DeAndre and the sudden terrifying hostility of the room. Catherine's breath began to hitch. The sheer sensory shock of the environment was tearing through her carefully maintained aristocratic poise. Her hands shook violently. She needed a crutch. She needed the one thing that always smoothed over the ugly, uncomfortable moments of her life. She needed to feel like she was still in charge. She turned to a broad-shouldered security guard standing by the kitchen entrance. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "You!" Catherine snapped, her voice shrill and demanding, trying desperately to summon the authority she used on her housekeepers. "I need a glass of wine. Right now, a Cabernet. My blood pressure is spiking dangerously high and my nerves are completely shot. Bring me a glass immediately before I have a medical emergency." The guard looked at her. He did not rush to the kitchen. He did not offer a polite apology or bow his head. He simply walked over to a stainless steel utility sink in the corner of the room and grabbed a flimsy clear plastic cup from a cheap dispenser. He turned on the cold tap, filled the plastic cup with unfiltered water, and walked back to Catherine. He shoved the wet, dripping plastic cup directly into her trembling hand. "Service is for paying guests only." The guard stated, his voice flat and completely devoid of respect. Catherine stared at the plastic cup as if he had just handed her a live grenade. Cold water spilled over the rim, dripping onto her expensive silk blouse. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was entirely incapable of processing a world where someone told her no. She had never been denied service in her entire adult life. William, witnessing this ultimate indignity, finally snapped. The primal, arrogant patriarch inside him roared to life. He puffed out his chest, stepping squarely into the guard's personal space. He was used to intimidating men twice his size simply by wielding his bank accounts and his family name like a bludgeon. He operated under the delusion that he still held the cards. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" William bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "We are not some street trash you can push around. We are clients of PK. We just signed over our entire estate to her firm to protect it. We demand absolute respect, and I demand to speak to her immediately. Get her back in this room right now." The guard did not flinch. He did not step back. He looked down at William with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He slowly uncrossed his arms and let them hang at his sides, stepping forward to close the distance between them. "PK just legally acquired all your assets for $1. Your credit cards have been canceled. You are trespassing." William stared at this guard. The word trespassing hung in the freezing air, a concept so entirely foreign to a man who had spent his life owning everything he touched that his brain simply refused to process it. He opened his mouth to unleash a torrent of legal threats to remind this hired muscle exactly who he was dealing with. But the guard simply turned his back, stepped through the heavy oak door, and let it slam shut. The sharp click of the latch echoed like a gunshot in the stripped, cavernous room. They were utterly alone. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the harsh, buzzing hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The luxury cabin, once a symbol of their untouchable status, now felt like a concrete holding cell. The automated climate control had been completely disabled, and the bitter mountain chill was already seeping through the floorboards, biting into their skin. Catherine wrapped her arms around her torso, her expensive silk blouse offering absolutely zero protection against the dropping temperature. She began to pace the bare hardwood floor, her designer heels clicking rhythmically. Panic was setting in, but it was quickly being overshadowed by a much more primal instinct. Her stomach gave a loud, hollow growl. She had not eaten since the morning, assuming this high-end retreat would be a continuous feast of catered delicacies. She stopped pacing and glared at the swinging doors leading to the kitchen. Her delusion, built over decades of extreme wealth, acted as a shield against the reality of their situation. She refused to accept that her money was gone. She was Catherine, matriarch of a financial empire, and she was not going to starve in a mountain cabin. "I'm going to get us some food," Catherine announced, her voice brittle but carrying a desperate edge of authority. "There has to be something left in there. These people work for the resort. If I demand a meal, they have to serve me." William did not answer. He was still staring at the blank wall where a priceless oil painting had hung just moments before, his mind trapped in a loop of his own collapsing legacy. Courtney remained curled in a ball on the floor, shivering violently, her eyes blank and vacant. Catherine marched toward the kitchen, pushing through the swinging doors with a heavy shove. She expected to find the culinary team cowering, waiting for instructions. Instead, she found a spotless industrial steel room, gleaming under harsh lights. The massive walk-in refrigerators were secured with heavy steel padlocks. The pantries were entirely empty. A side door near the loading dock suddenly clicked open. The head chef stepped into the kitchen, wearing a pristine white coat, his face completely devoid of expression. Catherine immediately straightened her posture, lifting her chin to look down her nose at him. Finally, Catherine snapped, pointing a manicured finger at the stainless steel prep table. "I demand a meal. I do not care what your instructions are regarding the assets. We are human beings, and we require food. Prepare a filet, medium rare, and whatever sides you have left. Bring it to the main room immediately." The chef did not argue. He did not apologize for the inconvenience. He simply gave a single curt nod and retreated through a secondary door into a back prep room. Catherine let out a sharp breath of vindication. She turned and walked back into the living room, a smug, triumphant smile playing on her pale lips. "They are bringing food," Catherine announced to William and Courtney. "You just have to know how to speak to these people. You cannot let them think they have the upper hand." 10 minutes later, the swinging kitchen doors opened. The head chef walked into the main living room, carrying a heavy silver tray. William slowly turned his head. Courtney pulled herself up from the floor, her eyes desperate and hungry. Catherine took a seat at the bare mahogany dining table, folding her hands expectantly, waiting to be served. The chef stopped beside the table. He set down a single plain white plate. Next to it, he placed a black leather billfold. Catherine frowned, leaning forward to inspect the plate. Her triumphant smile vanished instantly. It was plain boiled pasta. There was no sauce. There was no butter. There was no garnish. It was just a mound of cold, sticky noodles clumping together on the porcelain. "What is this insult?" Catherine demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "I ordered a steak. You expect us to eat this garbage? Payment is required up front," the chef stated, his voice completely flat. Catherine snatched the leather billfold from the table and flipped it open, ready to sign whatever exorbitant resort fee was required and dispute it later. She stared at the printed receipt. The blood drained completely from her face. She dropped the leather folder onto the table as if it had burned her fingers. The printed receipt read $5,000. Courtney, driven by gnawing hunger, scrambled over to the table. She looked down at the receipt and then at the plate of cold noodles. Her mind, already fractured by DeAndre leaving and her father's violent outburst, completely snapped. "Are you out of your mind?" Courtney yelled, her voice breaking into a hysterical, grating shriek as she stared at the chef. "We do not have that kind of money. Our accounts are frozen. We just signed away everything we own. We have absolutely nothing." A sharp crackle of static suddenly hissed from the ceiling. The high-fidelity speakers of the smart home system clicked on. Sydney's voice, smooth, perfectly modulated, and dripping with venom, filled the entire cabin. "Funny," Sydney said, the audio crisp and inescapable, echoing off the bare walls. "That is exactly what you told the doctors when they asked for funds to treat my pneumonia when I was 10. William froze, perfectly still. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in pure horror. The memory struck them like a physical blow. Sydney lying in a stifling charity ward hospital bed, her small lungs rattling with fluid, struggling to breathe. William standing in the hallway, arguing aggressively with the billing department, insisting that experimental treatments were an unnecessary expense that would cut into their upcoming vacation budget to Aspen. You left me there to choke on my own fluids so you could go skiing. Sydney's voice continued, the coldness in her tone, plunging the room into an even deeper freeze. You claimed poverty while you packed your designer luggage. Now you get to experience what a lack of funds actually feels like. Enjoy your dinner. A loud, heavy mechanical thunk resonated violently through the cabin walls. The massive front door electronically locked. The thick steel deadbolt slid into place with a definitive trapping click. Every exterior door in the house sealed shut simultaneously. On the wall near the kitchen, the digital smart thermostat beeped loudly. The glowing red numbers rapidly descended. 60 degrees. 55. 50. The heavy air conditioning vents overhead roared to life, blasting freezing winter air directly into the room. The heavy steel deadbolt slid into place with a definitive trapping click. Every exterior door in the house sealed shut simultaneously. On the wall near the kitchen, the digital smart thermostat beeped loudly. The glowing red numbers rapidly descended. 60 degrees, 55, 50. The heavy air conditioning vents overhead roared to life, blasting freezing winter air directly into the room. William stared at the digital thermostat, his breath already beginning to form faint white clouds in the rapidly chilling air. For a man who had spent 4 decades dictating reality, the concept of being physically trapped was entirely incomprehensible. His brain simply rejected the sensory data. He marched toward the massive oak front door, his expensive Italian leather shoes striking the bare floorboards with heavy, frantic steps. He grabbed the brass handle and yanked. It did not budge. He planted his foot against the doorframe and pulled backward with his entire body weight. The door remained as immovable as a bank vault. "Open this door!" William bellowed, slamming his fists violently against the solid wood. "You work for me! Do you hear me? I pay your salary! Open this door immediately!" Absolute silence answered him. Catherine rushed toward the glass entryway at the front of the cabin. She frantically dug into the pockets of her designer skirt and produced the sleek black keycard the valet had handed them upon arrival. She slammed it against the digital wall reader. A harsh red light flashed across the panel. The small screen read a single word: denied. She swiped it again. Another red light. She swiped it faster, her hands trembling uncontrollably as the biting cold of the room seeped into her bones. "It is not working," Catherine gasped, her voice shrill and echoing off the bare drywall. "William, the card reader is locked out. They deactivated our access." "Call someone," William barked, turning away from the door and pacing the room like a cornered animal. "Call our personal security. Call the local police. Call anyone." Courtney patted her empty dress pockets, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. "I do not have my phone. The security team at the front gate made us surrender our devices for the confidential meeting. They took everything. They even took my smartwatch." Catherine dumped the contents of her designer purse onto the bare dining table. Lipstick, a compact mirror, a silk handkerchief. There was no phone. She let out a jagged, hyperventilating breath, her aristocratic composure completely shattering. "Where are the cars?" Courtney cried, rushing to the massive window and pressing her face against the cold glass. "The valet took the keys. They parked the Mercedes around back. We can just break out and drive away. We have to leave right now." "We cannot walk out, Courtney," Catherine snapped, her voice breaking under the weight of her panic. "The doors are locked from the outside. The staff is gone. We are trapped in here." William's face twisted into a mask of feral rage. He refused to be caged. He refused to accept that the very legal loophole he thought would save his empire had been a carefully orchestrated trap. He scanned the stripped, barren room, his eyes landing on a heavy, solid oak dining chair that the removal crew had somehow overlooked in their haste. "Stand back," William ordered, grabbing the heavy chair by its backrest. He hoisted the solid wood furniture over his shoulder. The veins in his neck bulged as he swung the chair with all his might directly at the massive floor-to-ceiling window facing the dark woods. He expected the satisfying explosive crash of shattering glass. He expected a clear path to freedom. Instead, the chair violently ricocheted off the surface. A deafening, vibrating thud echoed through the room. The force of the impact sent violent shock waves traveling up William's arms, forcing him to drop the chair. He stumbled backward, clutching his wrists in agonizing pain. The glass did not have a single scratch on it. "Bulletproof!" William gasped, staring at the pristine window in absolute horror. "The entire cabin is reinforced. Why would a luxury mountain retreat have bulletproof glass?" Catherine demanded, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as the temperature plunged even further. William kicked the fallen chair across the room. It splintered against the concrete hearth of the dead fireplace. "This is unbelievable," William roared, pacing the floor, his face red with exertion and fury. "Just my absolute bad luck. Every single time I build something incredible, the universe conspires against me. The SEC investigations, DeAndre running off, and now this psycho trap. Nothing is ever straightforward for me. I do everything right and I get punished." Catherine stared at her husband, the sheer absurdity of his words temporarily breaking through her panic. "Bad luck," Catherine yelled, stepping forward. "You just willingly signed over our entire net worth to a complete stranger to avoid federal prison." "That is not bad luck, William. That is catastrophic stupidity. You gave away my art. You gave away my offshore accounts." "I did it to save us," William shot back, pointing an accusatory finger at his wife. "I made a calculated executive decision. If you had a better plan to stop the FBI from seizing our bank accounts, you should have spoken up. You were happy to sign those papers 10 minutes ago." While her parents tore each other apart in a useless battle of egos, Courtney remained glued to the window, staring out into the pitch-black forest. The wind howled violently against the reinforced glass. The brutal reality of their situation was finally cementing itself in her mind. They had no money. They had no phones. They had no cars. They had no allies. They were entirely isolated in a high-tech fortress designed to keep the world out, and it was currently being used to keep them locked inside. "Mom," Courtney whimpered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely articulate the words. "I am so cold. We are going to freeze to death in here." William turned away from Catherine, marching back to the heavy oak door. He began pounding his fists against the wood again, his knuckles bloodying against the rough grain. "Hey!" he screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing uselessly down the empty corridor. "We will double whatever she is paying you. Just open the door. I can write you a check right now." He stopped, his fists resting against the wood. He had no checkbook. The accounts were empty. The assets belonged to the Obsidian Group. He literally had nothing left to offer anyone. Suddenly, a loud mechanical clank echoed from the depths of the cabin's utility room. The harsh fluorescent bulbs overhead flickered, once buzzed violently, and then completely died. The entire cabin was instantly plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. Not a single sliver of ambient moonlight penetrated the reinforced steel shutters or the bulletproof glass. The backup generators had been entirely disabled. The harsh whirring of the air conditioning units ground to a complete, terrifying halt. Courtney screamed, a piercing sound of pure, unadulterated terror cutting through the pitch black. Catherine reached out blindly in the dark, her hands grasping at the freezing, empty air. "William, where are you? What just happened? Get the lights back on." "Nobody move," William ordered, his voice trembling in the freezing blackness. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not walk around." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The sound of their panicked, rapid breathing and chattering teeth was the only noise inside the pitch-black vault. Then, from the dark woods directly outside the bulletproof window, a sound ripped through the quiet night. It was not the wind. It was a deep, guttural, vibrating roar. It was the massive, terrifying sound of a large bear close enough that they could hear the heavy, deliberate crunch of its paws against the frozen brush. The guttural roar vibrated through the floorboards, a heavy, primal sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. It was not a distant echo. The beast was just on the other side of the bulletproof glass, separated from them by a few inches of engineered transparent armor. The crunch of heavy paws snapping frozen branches sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through the pitch-black room. Courtney screamed, a piercing, jagged sound that ripped through the freezing air. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her designer dress snagging on the rough hardwood floor as she blindly tried to put as much distance between herself and the window as possible. She crashed into the base of the mahogany dining table, curling into a tight, trembling ball. "Shut your mouth!" William hissed, his voice cracking with a fear he could no longer hide. "Do not make a sound. Do not give it a reason to test the glass." He was standing somewhere near the center of the room, completely paralyzed. The man who had commanded boardrooms and dictated the lives of thousands was reduced to a trembling silhouette in the dark, entirely stripped of his power. He could not throw money at the beast outside. He could not intimidate the freezing temperature dropping steadily inside the cabin. For the first time in his life, William was absolute prey. The air conditioning vents continued to roar, pumping frigid winter air into the sealed environment. The temperature had already plummeted past 50 degrees, and the bite of the cold was becoming unbearable. Without the ambient heat of the fireplace, the luxury cabin was rapidly turning into an industrial freezer. Catherine blindly reached out her hands, frantic as she searched the dark. Her fingers brushed against the rough fabric of William's suit jacket. She grabbed his sleeve, gripping the wool with desperate clawing strength. Her teeth chattered so loudly they echoed in the quiet gaps between the wind howling outside. "William, do something." Catherine sobbed, her aristocratic composure completely annihilated. "Call out to the guards. Break a window on the other side. We cannot just stand here in the dark. We are going to freeze to death." "I cannot see a single thing," William snapped, shoving her hand away in the pitch black. "The shutters are sealed. The doors are magnetically locked. We have no tools, no phones, and no light. If I stumble around, I will break my neck. Just stay still and wait for the morning. Someone has to come for us." But nobody was coming. That was the crushing reality settling over the room. The isolation was absolute. Courtney began to hyperventilate. The sound of her rapid, shallow breathing filled the space, a desperate gasping for air that she could not seem to catch. Her chest heaved. The darkness was pressing against her eyeballs, suffocating her. She wrapped her arms around her head, rocking back and forth against the leg of the table. "Why is this happening?" Courtney cried out, her voice ragged and childlike. "Why is she doing this to us? We gave her the assets. We signed the papers. Why are we locked in here?" Catherine stood frozen in the dark, the biting cold stinging her bare arms. Courtney's hysterical, pleading question hung in the freezing air, acting as a brutal catalyst. The environment was meticulously designed. The freezing temperature, the pitch-black isolation, the sound of a wild predator lurking just beyond the tree line. It was not random, it was an exact replication of a nightmare. "The woods," Catherine whispered in the dark, her voice trembling with a horrifying realization. "It is exactly like that summer. Oh my God, the summer we left her." "Shut up!" Catherine, William ordered, his voice laced with venom. "Do not start this right now." But Catherine could not stop. The guilt surfacing in her mind was not born out of any genuine maternal remorse. It was born entirely out of self-preservation and raw fear. She finally understood the architecture of their punishment. She understood the scale of Sydney's vengeance. "We drove her out to the state park," Catherine babbled, her words tumbling over each other as she stared blindly into the black void of the cabin. "It was freezing that night. We told her to wait by the trees while we turned the car around. We turned off the headlights. We left her in the pitch black. She was only a child. She ran after the car crying and we just drove away. We left her to the wolves, William." "I told you to shut your mouth!" William roared, kicking the leg of the dining table in the dark. "What is done is done. We made a choice to protect the family from a disturbed child. We did what we had to do." "She is making us live it!" Catherine sobbed, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "Do you not see it? She took everything we own, and now she is leaving us in the freezing dark with the animals. She wants us to feel exactly what she felt. We are never getting out of here. She is going to let us die in the dark." The psychological terror of Catherine's words paralyzed the room. The role reversal was complete. They were no longer the untouchable billionaires holding all the cards. They were helpless, abandoned, and terrified, experiencing the exact paralyzing vulnerability of a discarded child. The darkness swallowed their pride and the freezing air stripped away their arrogance. A sharp electronic beep suddenly sliced through the heavy silence. William, Catherine, and Courtney collectively gasped, their heads snapping toward the sound. At the far end of the long, dark corridor leading away from the main living area, a single red emergency light blinked to life. The crimson glow was faint, but in the absolute blackness of the cabin, it looked like a beacon. The bloody red light illuminated a heavy solid oak door at the end of the hall. A polished brass plaque on the center of the wood caught the red reflection. It read, "Manager's Office." Before anyone could move or breathe, a loud metallic clack echoed down the hallway. The heavy oak door slowly clicked open. William did not hesitate. The primal earth-shaking roar from the darkness outside shattered his paralysis. He lunged down the narrow corridor toward the single blinking red bulb. Catherine grabbed Courtney by the wrist, hauling her daughter up from the hardwood floor with a violent jerk. They stumbled blindly through the pitch-black cabin, careening off the freezing drywall, driven forward by sheer, unadulterated terror. The heavy crunch of snow and snapping branches outside echoed loudly, tracking their movement. William hit the heavy oak door shoulder first. It swung inward, crashing against the wall with a hollow thud. The emergency light from the hallway bled into the room, casting long, distorted crimson shadows across a massive office space. "Find a landline." William barked, his breath pluming in the red-tinted freezing air. "There has to be a hardline, an emergency intercom, something. Find it now." He dropped to his knees, his hands frantically feeling along the icy baseboards for a phone jack or a hidden wire. Catherine scrambled to the large mahogany desk dominating the center of the room. She threw open the heavy wooden drawers, sweeping her trembling hands over the smooth interior surfaces. The harsh metallic clatter of empty drawers slamming shut filled the room. Courtney joined the frantic search, ripping open a row of stainless steel filing cabinets against the far wall. They were completely empty. The desk drawers were bare. There was no phone. There was no radio. There was no panic button. William let out a guttural cry of frustration, slamming his fist against the floorboards. As Catherine backed away from the desk, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath, her eyes began to adjust to the dim, bloody light. She turned around. The entire perimeter of the massive office was lined with towering industrial whiteboards. Catherine stepped closer, her breath catching sharply in her throat. She recognized the thick, embossed letterhead pinned to the exact center of the board in front of her. It bore the crest of her philanthropic foundation. Thick red marker lines spiderwebbed across the white surface, connecting her foundation's charity ball expenses directly to her personal offshore accounts. Every single fraudulent tax write-off, every diverted donation meant for pediatric hospitals that she had secretly funneled to fund her European shopping sprees and private art acquisitions was meticulously documented. The offshore shell companies she thought were untraceable were laid out with terrifying accuracy, complete with account numbers and wire transfer dates. "William," Catherine gasped, her voice barely a raw whisper, "look at the walls." William pulled himself up from the floor, his knees popping in the cold. He turned to the wall on his left. The remaining air left his lungs in a sharp rush. Pinned across the white surface were bank records, encrypted wire transfers, and internal corporate memos he had personally ordered shredded 5 years ago. The exact trail of his embezzlement, the illegal stock manipulation that the SEC had only suspected but could never prove, was mapped out flawlessly. The names of his fall guys were circled in black ink. The exact amounts of the bribes he paid to federal regulators were listed beside them. It was a complete, undeniable blueprint of his entire criminal enterprise. His high-priced lawyers could never defend against this. The evidence was absolute. On the other side of the room, Courtney stumbled backward away from the third wall, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Illuminated in the eerie red glow were glossy photographs, bank statements, and printed text messages. She stared at a high-resolution police photo of a shattered bumper from a hit-and-run accident 2 years ago right next to the bank draft, showing the hush money she paid the victim's family to keep her name out of the press. Below that was a staggering, itemized list of unpayable debts from illegal underground poker games she thought she had hidden from everyone. The blackmail payments, the wire transfers to offshore gambling syndicates, her secret life was fully exposed. The crushing gravity of the room collapsed down on them. This was not a sudden betrayal. This was a decades-in-the-making masterpiece of revenge. Sydney did not just swoop in to buy their sinking estate for a single dollar. She had orchestrated the sinking. She was the one who fed the anonymous tips to the SEC. She was the one who manipulated their creditors and froze their assets. She had isolated them, systematically stripped them of their wealth, their power, and their allies, and legally bound them to this exact, inescapable location. They were never brought to this remote mountain retreat to hide from the federal authorities. They were not here to be saved. They were brought here to be completely destroyed. The financial ruin had simply been step one. The physical and psychological torture they were experiencing right now was step two. They were the prey. The heavy silence of their devastating realization was suddenly broken by a sharp mechanical click from the center of the ceiling. A low, rhythmic whirring filled the freezing room. A beam of stark, blinding white light sliced through the crimson darkness, cutting through the freezing air and projecting directly onto the only blank wall remaining in the office. The sudden brightness forced William, Catherine, and Courtney to shield their eyes. The stark white rectangle flickered rapidly, the harsh light shifting into a grainy, low-resolution wash of green and gray. A digital timestamp appeared in the bottom right corner of the projection, displaying a date from exactly 20 years ago. The video began to play. The grainy green and gray footage flickered against the blank white wall, the stark contrast of the projection illuminating the terrified faces of William, Catherine, and Courtney. The date stamp in the bottom right corner burned a bright, undeniable white. August 14th, 2006. The camera angle was high-positioned under the rusty awning of a remote, densely forested gas station, looking directly down at a cracked concrete parking lot. The video was entirely silent, rendering the events unfolding on the wall even more disturbing. A silver luxury SUV pulled up to the pumps. The heavy doors swung open. William stepped out onto the concrete. He looked younger, his posture arrogant, even then, his hair dark and neatly styled. Catherine sat in the passenger seat, checking her reflection in the sun visor mirror, completely unbothered by her surroundings. The rear driver's side door opened slowly. A young girl, barely a teenager, stepped out into the harsh summer sun. She wore a faded yellow sundress, her shoulders hunched, holding a small plastic water bottle. It was Sydney. She walked hesitantly toward the side of the building, pushing open the rusted door of the station restroom. The heavy door swung shut behind her. The exact moment the latch caught the video captured William's sudden movement. He did not reach for the gas pump. He did not walk inside the station to buy a coffee. He turned his head and looked directly at Catherine through the windshield. Even in the grainy resolution, the malicious, calculated intent was obvious. His shoulders shook with a distinct, callous laugh. He spun around, yanked the driver's side door open, and threw himself into the seat. The brake lights flared bright red on the screen. The SUV slammed into gear. The vehicle peeled out of the station with violent speed tires kicking up massive clouds of dust and gravel as it merged onto the desolate tree-lined highway and vanished from the frame. 10 agonizing seconds passed on the silent footage. Then 20, then 30. The rusted restroom door opened. The 13-year-old girl stepped out into the bright sunlight. She walked toward the pumps. She stopped. She looked at the empty space where the silver SUV had been parked just moments before. She looked up and down the deserted highway, her small frame rigid with sudden dawning terror. Panic set in instantly. She dropped the plastic water bottle. It bounced across the concrete, rolling out of frame. She started running toward the highway, her thin legs pumping frantically against the pavement. She reached the edge of the road, her mouth stretched open in a wide, desperate scream that the silent security footage swallowed whole. She sprinted down the shoulder of the highway, chasing a cloud of dust that had already settled. She ran until her foot caught on a jagged pothole. She crashed hard into the dirt, her knees violently scraping against the rough gravel. She did not get back up. She simply lay in the dirt, her small body heaving with silent, agonizing sobs as the long shadows of the dense Oregon pines slowly crawled over her. Catherine clamped her hands over her mouth, muffling a choked, wretched sound. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug brutally into her own cheeks as the projection cast shifting shadows across her horrified eyes. She stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the floorboards until her back hit the whiteboard, mapping out her fraudulent charities. The air in her lungs turned to ice. "Where did PK get this?" Catherine whispered, her voice trembling so violently the words barely formed. "This was 20 years ago. The police said the tapes were wiped. We paid the station owner $50,000 to destroy the drives. How does she have this?" William stood entirely frozen, the harsh light of the projector reflecting off the cold sweat pooling on his forehead. The absolute arrogance that had defined his entire existence was entirely eradicated, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. The pieces of the trap slammed together in his mind with terrifying clarity. The alias PK. The mysterious, aggressive venture capitalist who had swooped in out of nowhere to save his collapsing empire. The woman who demanded they sign their entire estate over for exactly $1 to avoid federal asset seizure. The anonymous savior was the same 13-year-old girl they had left in the dirt to die. Sydney had not just survived the woods, she had weaponized herself. She had spent 2 decades meticulously hunting them. She had orchestrated the SEC investigations. She had manipulated their creditors. She had dismantled their wealth piece by piece, buying their debt, buying their silence, and buying the very mountain cage they were now locked inside. Courtney pressed her hands fiercely over her ears, shutting her eyes tightly, completely refusing to look at the screen. She was 12 when it happened. She remembered sitting in the climate-controlled back seat, clutching her designer doll, while her parents casually told her Sydney was going to a special boarding school for troubled girls. She had never questioned it. She had enjoyed the extra attention, the extra inheritance, the sudden absence of her complicated older sister. The absolute destruction of her insulated, pampered reality was far too heavy for her fragile mind to carry. She collapsed against the filing cabinets, weeping uncontrollably. The projector suddenly clicked off. The blinding white rectangle vanished, plunging the massive office back into the oppressive crimson-tinted shadows of the single emergency light. The mechanical whirring of the machine died down, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than concrete. The room reeked of their exposed guilt, their darkest, most guarded secret ripped open and laid bare. The freezing air blowing from the vents felt like a physical punishment. Then a voice spoke. It did not come from the ceiling speakers this time. It did not echo through the electronic intercom. It came directly from the darkest corner of the office behind a massive leather executive chair shrouded entirely in shadows. "Do you know what a 13-year-old girl has to do to survive 3 days in the Oregon woods without food or water?" The question hung in the freezing air, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the roaring hum of the air conditioning vents. From the deepest pocket of shadows in the far corner of the manager's office, a figure slowly rose. The heavy leather of the executive chair groaned in the quiet room. The rhythmic, deliberate sound of boots striking the hardwood floor echoed like a metronome, counting down their final seconds. The figure stepped out of the absolute dark and into the fringes of the blinking red emergency light. It was PK, the ruthless, untouchable venture capitalist who had systematically dismantled their empire. The woman who had bought their legacy for a single dollar. But she did not look like the corporate shark who had cornered them in the boardroom. She moved with a terrifying, predatory stillness. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hands to her face. She grasped the thick, geometric designer frames that constantly shielded her eyes and pulled them away. She let them drop. The expensive glasses hit the floorboards, and she brought the heel of her boot down, crushing the lenses into jagged splinters. William stopped breathing. The sound of the cracking glass sounded like a gunshot in the enclosed space. She reached into the pocket of her tailored slacks, pulled out a thick fabric wipe, and brought it to her face. She scrubbed viciously at her skin. The heavy, severe contouring makeup that had artificially sharpened her jawline and aged her features wiped away in thick, muddy streaks. She dropped the soiled cloth onto the floor. The face underneath was softer, entirely natural, but etched with a cold, hollow hardness. Then she raised 2 fingers to her right eye. She pinched the bright hazel contact lens and pulled it free, letting it fall. She repeated the motion on her left eye. The eyes that looked back at them were a striking, piercing gray. They were the exact same shade of gray as William's late mother. The physical transformation was complete. PK was gone. The corporate armor had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. Courtney pressed her spine against the steel filing cabinet so hard the metal buckled and popped. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow gasps. She was hyperventilating, her eyes blown wide with a horror so absolute it paralyzed her vocal cords. She recognized that face. She recognized the sharp slant of her nose and those striking gray eyes. It was the face she had seen in the rearview mirror 20 years ago, shrinking in the distance as their SUV sped away. It was the older sister she had happily replaced, the sister whose disappearance had guaranteed Courtney a larger trust fund and undivided parental attention. "You?" Courtney choked out, her voice a ragged, wheezing wheeze. "It is you." William slammed his back against the whiteboard, his hands gripping the edges of the dry erase tray. The man who had spent his life crushing competitors and manipulating markets was entirely reduced to a trembling hollow shell. He stared at the living consequence of his ultimate sin. The child he had deemed a financial liability, the daughter he had discarded like unwanted trash to protect his wealth, now held that very wealth and his life in her bare hands. The absolute arrogance that defined him was entirely eradicated. "This is a trick," William stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably in the freezing air. "This is a sick game. Sydney is dead." Catherine's legs gave out. She dropped to her knees on the icy floorboards, her designer dress pooling around her in the dirt. Her hands flew up, clawing at her own throat as if trying to rip the air back into her suffocating lungs. She stared at the ghost standing in front of her, the reality of the situation fracturing her narcissistic mind into a million irreparable pieces. "No," Catherine screamed. The sound tore through her vocal cords, raw and desperate. "No, you are dead. You are dead." Sydney simply watched her, her face devoid of any human empathy. "The police searched those woods for weeks," Catherine babbled hysterically, dragging herself backward on her knees until she hit the heavy mahogany desk. "They brought in helicopters. They brought in dogs. They told us you were gone. They found your jacket. They found the blood on the rocks. They said you were eaten by a bear." Catherine's hysterical confession hung in the air, a pathetic testament to her own fabricated reality. They had used that bloody jacket to close the case. They had turned Sydney's horrific disappearance into a tragic story for social sympathy. Catherine had played the grieving mother at high society charity galas, using her dead daughter to garner donations and secure her place in the social elite. They had collected the life insurance payout, sealed the files, and never looked back. The prop she had used for 2 decades to gain sympathy was now standing in front of her, acting as her executioner. "You cried for the cameras," Catherine Sydney said, her voice a low, terrifying rasp that did not echo. "You wore black silk to the country club. You accepted casseroles from the neighbors while you signed the papers to liquidate my college fund." Sydney took a slow step forward. She walked directly into the path of the projector's beam. The grainy, harsh white light washed over her, illuminating a jagged, raised scar running down the left side of her neck, a brutal physical testament to the Oregon woods. "You left me to die," Sydney stated, the absolute certainty of her words cutting deeper than the freezing temperature. "You left me to the wolves and the cold. You thought the forest would do your dirty work. You thought the animals would clean up your mess." She looked down at the woman cowering on the floor, her gray eyes burning with a rage that had been fermenting for 20 years. "I was not eaten by the bear," Mother Sydney whispered softly into the dark. "I became one." The absolute silence that followed her words was suffocating. Catherine stared up at the woman she had birthed and discarded. Her mind was entirely unable to bridge the gap between the terrified 13-year-old girl she left in the dirt and the ruthless billionaire standing above her. Sydney did not blink. Her gray eyes were dead, completely devoid of any warmth or familial recognition. She moved out of the blinding projector beam. The red emergency light caught the sharp, brutal line of her scar. She began to speak. Her voice was flat. It carried the mechanical cadence of a judge reading a death sentence. She detailed the first night in the Oregon woods, the temperature dropping below freezing, the terrifying sound of unseen predators moving through the dense underbrush. She explained how she drank stagnant rainwater from the muddy tire tracks left by their silver SUV just to keep her organs from shutting down. She did not cry as she recounted the agonizing hunger and the vivid hallucinations that set in on the second day. She simply stated the facts. A pair of off-duty park rangers found her on the morning of the fourth day. She was miles off the main road, severely dehydrated and clutching a sharp rock she had intended to use as a weapon. When the hospital staff asked for her name, she gave them nothing. She remained completely silent for 6 consecutive months as a Jane Doe in the state system. She knew if she revealed her identity, the authorities would immediately return her to the parents who had tried to execute her. She waited patiently until she was legally old enough to secure a ruthless state attorney. She legally emancipated herself in a closed court session, completely severing her ties to the monsters who shared her bloodline. William shifted his weight against the whiteboard. His breath rattled loudly in his chest. His survival instincts, honed by decades of cutthroat corporate warfare, suddenly flared up. He tried to force a mask of paternal concern over his terrified features. He took a slow, trembling step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Sydney, listen to me," William stammered. His voice cracked violently in the freezing air. "You have it all wrong. It was a mistake. We came back for you. We just drove down the road as a joke. We turned around 5 minutes later, but you were gone. We searched everywhere. We thought we lost you forever. It was a tragedy." Sydney did not raise her voice. She did not express anger. She calmly reached into the inner pocket of her tailored blazer. She withdrew a folded yellowing document and let it drop onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a soft, definitive slap. It was a certified copy of the original police report. "You did not report me missing until 4 days later," Sydney stated. Her tone dropped the temperature in the room by another 10 degrees. "You did not search the road. You did not call the highway patrol. You drove straight back to the city. On day 2, you attended a high-profile charity gala. On day 3, Catherine spent $40,000 at a boutique in Paris. On day 4, you formally liquidated my college trust fund and transferred the assets directly into Courtney's name. You only called the police when a suspicious neighbor asked where I was. You wanted me gone. You orchestrated my death to balance your books." Courtney let out a sharp, pathetic wail. She slid down the side of the filing cabinet until she was curled in a fetal position on the floor. She had spent the stolen trust fund on designer clothes and luxury vacations. The moral guilt was not tearing her apart. The horrifying realization that she was finally going to pay for it was destroying her nervous system. "I built my entire life in the shadows," Sydney continued. Her heavy boots paced a slow, methodical circle around the terrified family. "I earned a full academic scholarship under a new identity. I studied forensic accounting and corporate law. I did not just build a financial empire. I built a machine designed for one specific purpose. I specialize in identifying, dismantling, and destroying corrupt family dynasties. I find the rot and I burn it to the ground." She stopped pacing and looked directly at Catherine. "I watched you cry on television. I watched you accept condolences from the governor. I watched you use my bloody jacket to solicit donations for your fraudulent charities. Every dollar you stole I tracked. Every bribe you paid I documented." Catherine sobbed, crawling forward and reaching a shaking hand toward Sydney's boots. "Please," Catherine begged. Her aristocratic pride was completely annihilated. "We are your family. We can fix this. You have your money. You proved your point. Please let us go. We will give you anything you want." Sydney looked down at the pathetic woman groveling on the floorboards. She felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication, only the cold, sterile satisfaction of a completed equation. "You still do not understand the architecture of this room," Sydney said, coming to a dead stop. "You think this is a lesson. You think this is a negotiation." She turned her piercing gaze to William. He was sweating profusely despite the freezing temperature. His eyes darted frantically around the room, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. He was finally realizing the absolute magnitude of his defeat. He had sold his soul to protect his wealth, and his discarded daughter had used that very wealth to build his tomb. You thought a phantom venture capitalist named PK was your saving grace, Sydney said. Her voice dropped to a lethal whisper. You thought signing over your assets would shield you from the federal indictments. You thought you outsmarted the system one last time. Sydney pressed a button on a small remote in her hand. The heavy magnetic locks on the reinforced oak door slammed shut with a deafening metallic crash. The sound echoed through the entire cabin, sealing them inside. I am the one who sent your tax records to the FBI, Sydney revealed. Her gray eyes locked onto William, watching his remaining hope evaporate. I provided them with the offshore account numbers. I handed them the blackmail photos. I initiated the total asset freeze that drove you to beg for a buyout. There was no savior coming to rescue your sinking ship. There was no PK coming to save you. The red emergency light blinked twice, casting a bloody wash over the terrified faces of the people who had thrown her away. The absolute certainty in Sydney's voice hung in the freezing air, a death sentence delivered with terrifying calm. For a fraction of a second, the room was entirely silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning vents pumping frigid air into the sealed office. Then the fragile remains of Courtney's pampered reality violently shattered. The realization that her entire life of luxury, her trust funds, her designer wardrobe, and her high society status were entirely built upon the discarded bones of her older sister broke her mind. Courtney let out a guttural, primal shriek. She pushed herself off the base of the filing cabinets, her manicured fingers curling into claws. She launched her body across the room, completely blinded by a mixture of entitlement and unadulterated rage, aiming straight for Sydney's face. She intended to tear the flesh from her sister's cheeks to violently drag her back down to the role of the victim. Courtney did not even make it halfway across the hardwood floor. From the pitch-black recesses flanking the heavy oak door, two towering figures materialized. They moved with terrifying, silent efficiency. The first security guard, a man built like a concrete pillar, intercepted Courtney's lunge with a single brutal motion. He grabbed her right wrist, twisting it sharply downward, while sweeping his heavy boot against the back of her knees. Courtney crashed onto the freezing floorboards with a sickening thud. The second guard stepped forward, instantly pressing his heavy knee directly between Courtney's shoulder blades, pinning her flat against the ground. Courtney thrashed wildly, her designer dress tearing against the wood, her face pressed into the dust. She screamed obscenities, demanding they release her, demanding her father do something, but her voice was muffled against the floor. Sydney did not flinch. She did not take a single step backward. She merely looked down at her sister, with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing an insect under glass. William witnessed the effortless, brutal subjugation of his youngest daughter. He saw the massive armed men waiting in the shadows. He looked back at Sydney, standing completely unfazed in the center of the crimson-lit room. The tactical reality of the situation finally penetrated his arrogant mind. He could not fight his way out of this. He could not buy his way out. Force had failed. Intimidation was useless. He needed a new strategy. He needed to pivot. The man who had spent 3 decades manipulating corporate boards and federal judges instantly shifted gears. William dropped to his knees. The sudden submissive motion echoed loudly in the quiet room. He held his hands up, palms facing outward, a picture of manufactured vulnerability. He forced tears to pool in the corners of his eyes, utilizing the exact same performance he had perfected for shareholder apologies and press conferences. Sydney, William began, his voice thick with a perfectly calculated tremor. Look at what you have built. Look at the power you command. You orchestrated a hostile takeover of my entire empire, and you did it flawlessly. I am not angry. I am in awe. You survived. You adapted. You are brilliant. You are exactly like me. He took a shuffling step forward on his knees, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, frantic light. He ignored his wife sobbing against the desk. He ignored Courtney writhing under the boot of a security guard. He focused entirely on the winner. "You proved your point," William pleaded, his voice rising with theatrical emotion. "You proved you are the rightful heir. You beat me at my own game. We do not have to be enemies. We can be a family again. Think of what we could accomplish together with your capital and my connections. We would be unstoppable. I will be the father you always deserved, I promise you. I will be a real father to you now. Just tell me what you want me to sign. Tell me how we merge our assets." Sydney watched his performance. The corner of her mouth twitched, not with a smile, but with a micro-expression of pure, concentrated disgust. She stepped closer, her heavy boots clicking against the wood until she was standing inches away from his kneeling form. She looked down into his desperate, calculating eyes. "You think this is a corporate merger?" Sydney stated, her voice flat and completely devoid of human warmth. "You think you can negotiate a peace treaty from your knees? You look at me, and you do not see the child you left to freeze in the dirt. You see a highly profitable acquisition." William opened his mouth to protest, but Sydney cut him off, her tone dropping to a lethal, razor-sharp whisper. "You do not want a daughter, William. You want a bank account. But your accounts belong to me now." She turned her back on him, dismissing his existence entirely. She walked toward the heavy mahogany desk where Catherine remained paralyzed on the floor. William slumped forward, his hands hitting the icy floorboards as the final spark of his hope was permanently extinguished. He finally understood. There was no deal to be made. She had not come to join his empire. She had come to salt the earth where it stood. Sydney reached the desk. She looked down at Catherine. Her mother was shaking so violently, her teeth chattered audibly, her eyes wide with terror as she stared up at the monster she had created. "Throw them out," Sydney ordered, raising a hand to signal the guards. The room erupted into sudden, violent motion. The guard pinning Courtney hauled her up by the back of her ruined dress, ignoring her hysterical shrieks. The other guard grabbed William by the collar of his tailored suit, dragging the billionaire to his feet and shoving him forcefully toward the open doorway. They were being evicted into the freezing, pitch-black wilderness with absolutely nothing. "Wait," Sydney commanded softly. The guards paused at the threshold, holding the struggling father and daughter. Sydney crouched down until she was eye level with Catherine. She reached into the pocket of her blazer. She pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside the sealed bag were 2 crisp $100 bills and the cracked plastic cap of a water bottle. Sydney pressed the cold plastic bag firmly into Catherine's trembling, perfectly manicured hand. Her gray eyes locked onto her mother's terrified face. "You can figure it out," Sydney whispered. The massive oak doors of the cabin swung open instantly, sucking the climate-controlled air out of the room. A brutal, freezing gust of wind roared through the doorway, carrying a sideways sheet of icy rain. The storm had intensified, turning the Oregon night into a pitch-black, howling void. The security guards moved with ruthless mechanical precision. They did not listen to William's desperate, sputtering bribes. They completely ignored Courtney's shrill, hyperventilating shrieks. The guard holding William clamped a hand on the back of the billionaire's tailored suit jacket, half dragging and half carrying him across the polished hardwood floor. The second guard hauled Courtney by her arm, her designer heels skidding uselessly against the wood before snapping completely. Catherine stumbled backward, her legs refusing to support her weight. A third guard emerged from the shadows of the hallway. He gripped her firmly by the shoulders and marched her toward the open doorway. The transition from the warm, luxurious cabin to the brutal reality of the wilderness was instantaneous and violent. They were shoved unceremoniously out into the storm. The heavy boots of the guards marched them down the wide, illuminated steps of the resort porch. The pristine gravel driveway quickly gave way to the treacherous, unpaved perimeter of the property. The guards did not stop until they reached the edge of the dense, looming tree line. The ground here was a thick, churning soup of mud, freezing rain, and rotting pine needles. The guards shoved them forward simultaneously. William hit the ground hard, his hands plunging deep into the freezing mud. His custom Italian suit was instantly ruined, plastered to his shivering skin by the relentless downpour. Courtney collapsed beside him, her torn dress soaking up the filthy water like a sponge. She clawed at the mud, sobbing uncontrollably, her pampered nervous system entirely shutting down under the physical shock of the freezing rain. Catherine fell to her knees. The icy water seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, chilling her to the bone. She was trembling so violently she could barely feel her own fingers. But her hands remained desperately clamped around the small plastic bag Sydney had pressed into her palm. The guards turned in perfect unison and marched silently back up the gravel driveway. They stepped onto the illuminated porch, their massive silhouettes flanking the open doorway like stone gargoyles. Catherine knelt in the mud, the freezing rain whipping across her face. She looked down at her shaking hands. The ambient light from the cabin barely reached the edge of the woods, but it was enough to illuminate the contents of the bag. Sydney had told her she could figure it out. Catherine's numb, mud-caked fingers ripped the plastic seal open. She bypassed the crisp $100 bills resting on top. Those were a mockery, a distraction. Her fingers closed around the objects hidden beneath them. She pulled them out into the freezing rain. It was a single crumpled $20 bill. Next to it was a crushed, faded plastic water bottle. The label had long since rotted away. The plastic was brittle and yellowed with age. Inside, a few ounces of cloudy, stagnant water sloshed against the dented plastic. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The freezing rain seemed to entirely stop as a wave of paralyzing, suffocating horror crashed over her. The items were exact. They were unmistakable. 20 years ago, under the baking heat of a remote gas station awning, Catherine had rolled down the window of their luxury SUV. She had tossed a single $20 bill and her half-finished bottle of water onto the cracked concrete. She had told her 13-year-old daughter to buy herself a snack. Then William had slammed the car into gear and sped away, leaving the child in a cloud of dust. Sydney had not just survived. She had crawled through the dirt, found the insulting garbage her mother had thrown at her, and she had kept it. She had carried that crumpled bill and that crushed bottle through the foster system. She had kept them through college. She had kept them while building a billion-dollar empire. They were not just pieces of trash. They were a sacred physical vow of vengeance. The realization that her daughter had meticulously preserved the exact instruments of her abandonment for 2 decades completely shattered Catherine's mind. The aristocratic vanity, the high society entitlement, the decades of willful ignorance were instantly incinerated. Catherine clutched the ancient water bottle to her chest and let out a raw, agonizing scream that was entirely swallowed by the roaring wind. William dragged himself up from the mud, his teeth chattering so hard they threatened to crack. He looked at his wife screaming at a piece of plastic. He looked at Courtney convulsing in the dirt. He turned his eyes back to the massive, glowing structure of the resort he used to own. The impenetrable blackness of the Oregon woods loomed immediately behind them. The trees creaked and groaned in the heavy wind, masking the sounds of whatever predators were moving through the dense underbrush. The temperature was dropping fast. They had no coats, no survival gear, and no cell phones. The sheer terror of the wilderness, the exact same terror they had forced upon a 13-year-old girl, was now their absolute reality. Sydney stood on the edge of the illuminated porch. The warm golden light of the cabin poured out from the open doorway behind her, framing her figure in a sharp, angelic halo. She was completely shielded from the storm. Her tailored clothes were perfectly dry. She looked down at the pathetic, mud-soaked creatures thrashing in the dirt at the edge of the tree line. The contrast was absolute. She was the apex predator, and they were the prey she had finally run to ground. William raised a shaking, mud-caked hand toward the porch. He tried to shout her name, but his throat was frozen. Only a pathetic, wheezing rasp escaped his lips. Sydney did not raise her voice, but her words sliced through the howling wind with perfect, terrifying clarity. The acoustic design of the porch carried her voice directly into the darkness, wrapping around them like a heavy iron chain. "The highway is an 8-hour walk through the dark," Sydney stated, her gray eyes burning with the cold satisfaction of a 20-year promise finally fulfilled. "If you survive the bears, the FBI is waiting at the end of the road. Let's see if you can handle it." Sydney did not wait for an answer. She stepped back into the lavish foyer of the cabin and pressed a heavy silver button mounted on the wall. The massive reinforced glass and steel doors slid shut with a smooth mechanized hum. The heavy deadbolts engaged with a sharp definitive crack. Instantly, the howling wind, the freezing rain, and the pathetic, desperate screaming of the family she had just discarded were entirely severed. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. Sydney turned her back on the glass doors. She did not look over her shoulder to watch them pound their bloody fists against the reinforced panes. She walked toward the burning fireplace, poured herself a glass of pristine room-temperature water, and drank it slowly. The hunt was over. The oppressive darkness of the Oregon storm eventually broke, giving way to a crisp, blindingly bright morning. The rhythmic, deafening thwack of heavy rotor blades cut through the crisp mountain air. Sydney sat in the rear of her private helicopter, sinking into the plush, cream-colored leather seat. She held a porcelain cup of hot tea between her hands, letting the soothing warmth radiate through her palms. The harsh, muddy contouring of PK was entirely gone. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her natural gray eyes reflecting the bright morning sun as it rose over the jagged peaks of the pine trees. She reached into her blazer and pulled out her encrypted smartphone. The screen illuminated with a secure notification. It was a message from DeAndre. DeAndre was a brilliant software developer whose groundbreaking medical tech startup had been viciously raided and bankrupted by William exactly 4 years ago. William had stolen his patents, ruined his reputation, and left him with millions in fabricated debt. Sydney had quietly approached DeAndre during her hostile takeover. She had funded his legal defense, dismantled William's shell companies, holding the stolen patents, and quietly transferred the intellectual property back to its rightful creator. Sydney opened the message. "I am in Chicago. My assets are secure. Thank you for giving me my life back." Sydney stared at the glowing text. She did not smile, but a profound, steady calm settled over her chest. She typed a single word in response. "Enjoy." She locked the screen. She had not just dismantled a corrupt empire. She had redistributed its stolen wealth to the people her father had crushed along the way. DeAndre was safe. The creditors were paid. The fraudulent charities were exposed. Every single ledger was balanced with absolute terrifying precision. The helicopter lifted smoothly off the private helipad. The ground fell away in a rush of wind and flying pine needles. Sydney turned her head and looked out the reinforced window, staring down at the sprawling, dense green canopy of the Oregon wilderness. The same wilderness that had nearly swallowed her whole 2 decades ago now looked small, manageable, and entirely powerless. As the aircraft banking toward the east, following the winding gray ribbon of the mountain highway, a stark contrast caught her eye. Down below, emerging from the thick, muddy tree line, were 3 tiny figures. They were moving at a pathetic, agonizingly slow pace along the gravel shoulder of the road. Sydney leaned closer to the glass. Even from 1,000 feet in the air, the absolute destruction of William, Catherine, and Courtney was undeniable. They were covered head to toe in thick, freezing mud. William was limping heavily, dragging his ruined Italian leather shoes across the jagged asphalt. Courtney was missing both of her heels, stumbling barefoot over the freezing gravel, her shredded designer dress hanging in filthy rags around her knees. Catherine was leaning heavily against William, her aristocratic posture completely broken, her body racked with violent shivers. They had survived the night. They had crawled through the freezing mud, evaded the wildlife, and dragged themselves through the exact same agonizing terror they had inflicted upon a 13-year-old girl. But their survival was not a victory. It was merely the transition to their final punishment. Sydney's eyes drifted a mile down the winding highway, directly into the path the 3 wretched figures were blindly walking toward. A barricade of black SUVs blocked the 2-lane road. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles cut sharply through the morning mist. A dozen heavily armed FBI agents stood by their vehicles, waiting patiently with federal warrants, handcuffs, and a mountain of irrefutable evidence of tax evasion, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. William, Catherine, and Courtney were marching step by agonized step directly into a federal cage. They had lost their wealth, they had lost their status. Now they were going to lose their freedom. Sydney watched them shrink into tiny, insignificant specks as the helicopter gained altitude and sped toward the horizon. She did not feel the need to hover. She did not need to watch them get pushed into the back of a police cruiser. The mechanics of their destruction were already in motion, and the machine she had built would run flawlessly without her supervision. She unlocked her phone one final time. She opened her contacts folder. She scrolled past her business associates, her lawyers, and her security contractors until she reached the bottom of the list. She selected the 3 files labeled with the names of the people who had brought her into the world and subsequently thrown her away. She pressed delete. The names vanished from the screen, leaving nothing but empty space. Sydney placed the phone face down on the polished wood table beside her. She picked up her cup of hot tea and took a slow, deliberate sip. She closed her striking gray eyes, leaning her head back against the soft leather. The rhythmic vibration of the helicopter felt like a steady, calming heartbeat. The freezing shadows of the Oregon woods, the phantom of the terrified girl left in the dirt, and the suffocating weight of her 20-year vengeance simply evaporated into the morning air. For the first time in 2 decades, Sydney felt completely, unapologetically free. The compelling narratives of betrayal illuminate a profound truth about survival and personal value. When those expected to protect us choose cruelty over compassion, the initial devastation feels insurmountable. However, the ultimate lesson lies in the aftermath. True liberation is not found in seeking revenge or waiting for apologies that may never arrive, but in the deliberate choice to sever toxic ties and build your own foundation. These stories demonstrate that genuine freedom only arrives when we finally define our own worth. Please share the firm boundaries you have established to actively protect your own peace and comment down below.